Hey there. This is my second time recording this, so I hope it goes a little bit better this time. I just want to give some of my thoughts about MIA and music. So a little bit of my background is that when I was a kid, I played violin from the age of 8, and I really was very enthusiastic at first, and then I ended up quitting many years later. But I was never enthusiastic, and I never wanted to practice or anything. I think a lot of the reason why is because the approach of my teachers was these are the songs you need to learn to pass your exam, and here are the scales you need to pass your exam, and here are the arpeggios you need to pass your exam. And that really was it. That was what music was. And I took music theory as a kid as well, and it didn't make any sense at the time. It was just, okay, I'm supposed to use this rhyme of Father Charles, and then I do something. I didn't understand why I was doing it. I was failing and whatever. And so then I began to play guitar for myself. I'm self-taught, and I'd watch YouTube videos, and I got really down the rabbit hole, and I became a bit of a theory nerd when I entered high school. And the reason why is because I was doing it for myself. I was doing it to understand music that moved me, and I'd say that most of the success that came with my guitar playing came from that self-motivation, which just goes to show that a class environment isn't really productive to success, if that makes sense. But that aside, I believe that the music tuition also, like, is the screen, it's literally like shining off of my glasses, so I hope that's not too annoying. uh, I believe that it's essentially blue pilled in some sense. And in high school, when I'd become a theory nerd, the reason why is because I heard all of these sounds in these songs that moved me, and I wanted to understand them and be able to utilize that emotion or that thing that had left an impression on me in my own music, which I think is very similar to in a language, how you want to comprehend it and then later on you want to be able to output. So it's the same. And I believe that. So I'm only kind of realizing after having gone into MIA for 6 months or whatever, how much the parallels are between music and Japanese or language acquisition, and that the success that I did have with guitar was essentially due to immersion, and that I think that I can use this information to keep going and keep getting better and better. So I'd say that I got pretty successful at being able to write melodies, for example. And the reason why is because what I did was I took all of my anime music, all my openings and endings, and obviously they'd come with the instrumental version as well, like the off vocal or the whatever they call it. So I would take all of those and make a playlist. And then for like sometimes even like 8 hours a day, I would just jam on top of that, use them as backing tracks. And through this, I got a quite intuitive understanding of how the chord changes were working. And I wasn't playing the changes. I wasn't going, okay, there's an A7 coming now. What are the target tones? I wasn't thinking like that. I was just trying to hear the pattern and adapt my playing respectively, I guess. And I'd say that I learned so much through this, and I became like very my intuitive grasp of a lot of sounds happened quite quickly. And like the cool thing about anime music specifically is that I'd say that compared to Western pop music, it's a lot more it uses a lot of different sounds. You'll get some Lydian sounds or some modal sounds and some chromaticism and some stuff that you wouldn't really associate with typical pop music. So for me, like, I in high school, like I said, became a bit of a theory nerd, and I was listening to music every day for hours. I was listening while I had breakfast in the morning on the way to school without talking to my parents. I know I was edgy, right? I would even like sneak my earphone through my blazer pocket because we had school uniforms, and I'd listen during class. There was a time, because we had 3 hour long detentions, like you get given an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours depending on how bad the thing you did was, and I got a 3 hour. So when I was in 8th or 9th grade, I listened to all of Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory in my head. So I don't think I could do that anymore. But like I was spending a lot of time listening to lots of different kinds of music. It's kind of funny, like I got into music at kind of the same time as I got really into anime and Japanese stuff. So I was listening to like I started with Linkin Park. Like that was the first band I ever really got into when I was like 8. And then Where to go from there? It's like it went into like Metallica and Megadeth and Slayer, and then heavier stuff like Cannibal Corpse. Although that came later, and then to prog like Dream Theater, and later Animals as Leaders and Periphery, and at the same time everything else was like expanding. So I'd be listening to other stuff that was outside of this kind of stuff, and I'd get more into jazz, and then with Japanese music, I'd say that was really, really good for me because it really stretched my ear to hear a whole bunch of different sounds. Like when I was maybe 12, I downloaded the entire Maho Sensei Negima, whatever, discography, or like music collection, and like there's some really cool stuff in there. I started downloading like more and more of this stuff, and I got into like Ali Project and Yosei Teikoku, and just like a whole bunch of different bands that really stretched my ear, and made me like listen to sounds that I didn't ever encounter. Like even like blues and country music, or like K-On! Soundtrack has some really, really cool stuff. Like Zazalma Way to Go is like, it's crazy. Anyway, so in high school, compared to my peers, because there was a music class of 8 of us, I'd say that my perspective with how I viewed music was that I was hearing these things that moved me, and I wanted to understand them. So every single concept that I learned was a tool to comprehend things. It's almost like a kanji or something like that. And the way that they viewed it was something that they need to pass their tests. And so, I don't want to say I was ostracized, because it's not like anybody was bullying me, but I'd put up my hand and be like, hey, we could use this sound there, we could use a secondary dominant or whatever. And they'd be like, oh, shut up, I don't care what you think because you're that guy, and that's kind of how it was. I'm not going to blame anybody for that, because it's the same as Matt being in a Japanese class. Not that I was like Matt, I wasn't super fluent at music and super amazing compared to my peers in a way that really like I had any obvious bragging rights or something like that. But in terms of my ability to comprehend theory and to use it in a practical way, I'd say that maybe it's a similar comparison, just for this sake. And so like what I do is I'd fill notebooks with all of these ideas. Like I went deep down a lot of rabbit holes. I learned I tried to like write down all the modes of the Hungarian minor and find all the chord scales. I have all of these books of all of these ideas that I had. Like, anyway, I learned about polyrhythms and odd time signatures and jazz harmony and stuff. And I had a lot of fun, and it was really amazing being able to listen to music and to then go, oh, I know this sound. I know this minor 251. I know that sound. I know that this Lydian sound. I know this whatever. And like that was really fun for me. It still is. And especially with odd time signatures, like if you're into progressive metal or stuff or things, one of the coolest things is hearing a rhythm and not comprehending it, and then through counting and through trying to work out the pattern and where the repeats happen, you can begin to pass together the structure. Like, oh, in this Meshuggah song, the beat over the 4/4 pattern is like 7/7/3/7/7/6, and it all fits within 4/4. I don't know if that necessarily did, probably didn't, but like this was stuff that really I found really, really fun, because it was like a puzzle I had to try to work out in real time, although it often take quite a few listens. So like that's kind of my background, and I'd say that like how I learned about harmony was through this exposure, through playing over these backing tracks. And I didn't necessarily even know all of the songs I was playing over, although a lot of the time I did. And recently what I've been trying to do is take songs that I know the melody of and just play the melody and not know it, like not having worked it out, not having learned the notes, not having music in front of me, just trying to play along with the melody, which is really quite hard. And something I'm also trying to do is that if I find myself in a box position I'm really comfortable with, like say I'm jamming out, I can play this melody easily because I'm in a minor scale box shape, then I'll try to move and play the melody somewhere else, so that I'm not thinking in terms of scale shapes, or that if I'm at least enforcing the weaker shapes within my brain, and trying to get intuitive in how melodies work there. Because I think, for me at least, playing in a minor box shape like makes melodies quite a lot more vivid than in a lot of other shapes. So yeah, like this is the long and short of it. I believe that how I learnt about things was through immersion, essentially, and that's kind of what set me apart from my friends who would, when they heard about modes in music class, they'd go, "Oh, well, this is a stupid thing that I have to learn for my tests," because to them, the music they played was to get to first position in orchestra or to pass their exam or to do well at a competition. The music they listened to was something that was pretty and it was just something they enjoyed, and then there was music theory they needed to pass their tests. And I don't think that way of looking at things is very healthy, or, there's no acquisition, there's no hearing something and understanding what it is and why it was chosen. And I want to just compare some of the things about languages to music. So when you think about it, language and music are basically, I don't want to say the same, but there's a lot that's very, very similar. Because when you think about it, they're both information that is being processed by the brain through audio, right? Through the things it hears, it has to it has to pass information and make sense of it, and then you're able to extract meaning from that. And for the purposes of this, I'm going to take that lyrics are something that I'm not even going to consider, because I think that's a separate thing, in some regards. So with music, I don't want to say that there is necessarily a right or a wrong, in the same way that there is with language, which I think is the biggest difference between them, in that with a language, you have correct grammar and incorrect grammar. I can say, this ball is, and that doesn't sound natural because it's incorrect because of reasons, right? But I can play a melody that sounds maybe bad to some people, but then I can say, oh no, but I meant to do that. And then perhaps if I was, a good musician, I could actually provide a context with harmony in which that would make perfect sense. So that's the main difference, which I think for this reason, the emphasis on input over output isn't necessary from a beginner level, but I will stress that some degree of understanding should be acquired before trying to utilize things. But the thing with music is that, even if it's just like once a week, just writing a song is not gonna have any negative effect. It's something that just shows you that you can also do it yourself. I believe that the better you get at music, or the more down your journey you go, you kind of lose things as well. Like at every moment, there is a song that you can only write now. And tomorrow, if you try to write it, you wouldn't be able to. So it's really interesting looking back on old songs because it's like I wouldn't be able to do that anymore. So maybe for this reason, I don't want to say emphasis on output, but just the fact that output is something that's able to be done. So I want to just talk about some of my goals in terms of what I think is possible through MIA with music. Is firstly, language and music both have a written form and a spoken form, if that's the way you want to put it. And I think comprehension on audio should be considered first until you have an understanding of like different chords, the way they sound, different ideas or different compositional techniques, like being able to hear a 2-5-1 or being able to hear this mode or being able to hear this something. Like that is the first thing that I think anybody should do. And then there needs to somehow be a way to connect written music to the way you hear it. So when you see score, right, you should be able to oralize that. You should be able to see it and hear it, which is something I'm not able to do very well. I've been able to read music for a very long time, but to be honest, on guitar, sight reading is something that I'm very, very bad at because I haven't really put very much of my grind hours into it. Something I'm trying to get better at. I'm trying to play chord melody. I'm trying to really broaden my horizons and try to do more fingerstyle, which is stuff that I've neglected for a very, very long time. And I believe that this is stuff that is really, really important. Like the way I learned how to have relative pitch is through using song examples, For example, like minor second is the Jaws theme. Not that I ever even watched Jaws, but it makes it very vivid to me. A minor sixth is Darren Gray's Obscure, goes bum bum, which is a perfect fifth, bum bum, which is a minor sixth. And like that really helps me to understand that. And I believe that I think Rick Beato has a video about how to, as an adult, you can acquire something that's very similar to perfect pitch through using song examples. Because when I recall a song in my head, most of the time it's in the correct key, or it's very close to the correct key. So if I go Kagayaka Girls, it's bum 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 bum, and let me just check that is in fact what an E sounds like. So I'm saying it's bum, which it is, right? So that's pitch memory. That's the ability to recall a song in the correct key. I believe that this is something that you can use and exploit, and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that in terms of visualizing, like as a guitarist, I do want to. There's some very specific things that I think I could help with in terms of. Okay, let me structure my thoughts a little bit better. So I think with Japanese, we're very fortunate that we have RTK, that we have Heisig, that we have these revolutionary ideas that allowed us to take very difficult concepts or very difficult ideas or characters that traditionally have been very difficult for non-native speakers of a language that uses these characters to learn. It's very, very difficult to learn 2,200 characters without Heisig or without a similar method. And that through doing this, we've been able to do this impossible feat. And I believe that there's room for in music a similar approach, just to like restructure the way that we learn it, and to use all of these like memorization techniques and mnemonics and using the imagination and trying to get my glasses straight. This is all stuff that we can work on and try to just like think, how can we optimize this process of learning this hard thing? And I think with relative pitch and perfect pitch and sight reading and sight singing, and actually that's something I want to talk about, is I think that an emphasis on singing maybe in the initial stages would be a really, really good way to help people internalize sounds. Because I have a lot of friends who, I helped out a lot with music, and I helped out with music theory and giving them access to a whole lot of sounds and ideas. And I'm going to just shut my door quickly because my mother's having a very loud phone conversation. And his main pitfall is that he plays with his fingers and with his vision far more than he plays with his ear. And like, this is something that I really don't want to happen to people. I don't want people to think this is what the minor shape looks like. And I've heard it described as the guitarist's mindset of modality. Is it's like, this is a shape, this is a shape, this is a shape. Like, that's helpful to an extent. But it's really not the be-all and end-all. Like, the sound is far more important. Like, knowing that in Kageyake Girls that it's a bam 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 bam, and that's a Mixolydian sound is like so much more important than knowing a Mixolydian shape on your instrument. Because honestly, you can play any major scale mode shape over any sound and it will be fine, as long as you are playing the right shape that has the same notes in the scale, if that makes sense. But anyway, I think that maybe an approach where to learn about different modalities and different chords, an approach where each chord is learnt. So maybe you start with a very simple chord. So you start with triads because that's the simplest thing. And you'd start with major because that's obviously a very simple chord. And then you would change one note of it and try to use mnemonics, or try to use your emotional connection to the sound or your emotional reaction to the sound to be able to identify it by ear, be able to see how it's written, and perhaps even with pitch memory, even be able to identify the notes, which is something that I'm unable to do unless I really think and put minutes into it, because I'd have to firstly work out what the note is with pitch memory. I don't have it for every note. I have it for some notes. I have to think, what song has this note? What key is that song in? Okay, then it must be D. And then I have to use relative pitch to work out all the intervals, and then I can begin to do this process. And I think that's really inefficient and really has a huge amount of work that can be done on it, right? So I think that maybe saying a major chord has this sound, and maybe just like in Heisig at the beginning, you can give people your opinion, or like an authority opinion saying, this is what you should be feeling, this is what you should be thinking of this chord as sounding like. And then as you go into harder and harder sounds, or more like detailed things like, I don't know, dominant 7, flat 9, sharp 5 or something, right? You can start to just give people hints like, hey, just remember that this note is usually sounds like this in this context, you know, or something like that. Or maybe a better example would be like major 7, sharp 11. It's like, this is a chord that's derived from the Lydian scale. It's brighter than your traditional major 7 sound. So keep that in mind while thinking about how you want to think about this chord. I don't know if that makes too much sense. But for example, like you could go major and then minor is one note different than that, if that makes sense. So it's one note darker. And how does this like change the relationship between the intervals of the chord? And then how does that change the emotional impact of that chord, or like the image of that chord, if that makes sense? And I think that this is a really, really good way to think about it. Because if you think about like, let's just do 7th chords, right? You get augmented major 7, which is like the brightest. You know, if you add a sharp 11, it's even brighter, but like augmented major 7 chord, then major 7, then dominant 7, then minor 7, then minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished, and then diminished 7 chord. Like that's the way to like think about how bright or how dark these sounds are. And looking at it that way is very vivid, but each one also has a specific like emotional identity in addition to that. I think this is made more complicated by the fact that context and the actual progression in which and the function of these chords also has a huge impact into how you perceive them. Just as a sentence has a huge amount of impact on the way that you perceive words. So I don't think it's that far of a stretch to say that this could be a really good approach, and that you could also learn about harmony and about scales and about chord scales and stuff through a very similar approach. But I think it's also really important to really acquire it on an intuitive and in your ear first. I think that's so important. I think the way that this could be done is by using song examples that are really relevant and really show the sound in a really comprehensible way, you know? I think the downside about this is that if you wanted to make this a structured approach, and you wanted to make Anki cards for this, you'd have to essentially give people a card that's really a good example of it, and they might not like that. They might not like that example. I don't think that's that different than in Take Him, though. It's like, these are sentences that I have no memory of or no like connection to, right? But it's still good just to see how the grammar rule works. So I think fucking blasting a K-On song or a death metal song into people's ears, even if they don't like that style, if it's really comprehensible, then I really think that it doesn't matter in the initial stages. So that's my thoughts on how people could start acquiring sounds. I think stuff like melody is a little bit harder, and especially in jazz, like you have to kind of know the licks. You have to like learn licks from different songs. And I guess like sentence mining in that sense might be quite useful, if that makes sense. So you'd play a jazz standard until you see a lick that makes sense or that is quite comprehensible, and then you'd SRS it. I don't know how that would work, and that's why I want to talk about these ideas. Like, how would you do that? Or you play jazz standards until you find a progression, and there's one chord that you don't understand the function of, and then you'd SRS that in an attempt to understand it. Or maybe on the front of an Anki card there could be a melody, and then you'd have to sing it, and then you'd flip it, and this is how you could learn how to read, you know? So you'd have to go and then you'd have to turn it over, and then it would play it into your headphones, and you'd have to get it right to pass the card. Like, is that a good way to do things? I don't know. I think with chords it's a lot more straightforward, because on the front of the card you can hear the chord and then have to identify it, and then using mnemonics and using stuff, you can make that process a lot more streamlined. I think this is stuff that could be really, really, really useful for a whole bunch of people. Like, I wish that these techniques existed, which is why I'm making this video. And then in terms of improvising as well, I think that like there's just so much that needs to go into it. Like, it's hard. It's really hard, because there's two traditional approaches to improvising, which I suppose is the musical equivalent of doing a speech. So let's say we wanted to play the jazz standard Nice Work If You Can Get It. I think I have it here somewhere. Here it is. So you can see all of the highlighter and all of the whatever. If I wanted to play over this tune and I wanted to improv, well, there's some things I need to know. So let's make the comparison that a jazz standard is like a conversation topic, right? It's like we're going to talk about the weather. That's kind of like what a jazz standard is like. And obviously some topics are closer than others, like Autumn Leaves and Fly Me to the Moon are quite similar. So maybe that's like the difference between talking about your favorite drink and your favorite food or something like that, or talking about ramen and soba, you know. I'd say like that's a pretty good comparison. So if you can do one, it's a lot easier to do the other. And I think that to be able to play a jazz standard, there's some things you need to be able to do. You need to understand the harmony and be able to play the chords. Obviously, maybe not if you're a trumpet player, but you need to still understand the chords and be able to play all the arpeggios. So understanding the harmony is like the first thing. Being able to play the melody is the second thing. And then from there, you have to, there's like two distinct approaches you can take. You can take an intuitive approach and just wing it and try to be musical over the changes. Or you can try to play the changes and try to go, B minor 7, I need to play over B minor 7. And that's really the way that most jazz musicians will approach things. They visualize target tones. And I find this really, really difficult. And obviously, like, this is because I've always thought about the guitar in terms of intervals and in terms of what degree of the scale am I playing, instead of thinking this note is a C sharp. Like, I'm still in the process of kind of making the note names on the guitar neck vivid. And this is after having composed and learned really difficult songs on guitar, you know, getting pretty good at the instrument. And the reason why is because it never really made too much sense. And like, I can read music perfectly, but sight reading is still fucking hard for me. And I don't really think that this is the best way to do things in terms of I need to just visualize chord tones. I think that maybe having the intuitive approach of being able to play chord tones and then being able to hear them and then see them on the neck and being able to read them, almost the same way that you learn a word from hearing it and then you SRS it and see what it looks like and learn to write it. But really, like, you have to know the word before learning it, if that makes sense. It's the same thing with kanji that Matt was saying. Like, you need to know Japanese to learn the kanji, but you need kanji to learn Japanese. So it's like a paradox. And I think it's quite similar in that for a lot of people, they have to learn the shapes to be able to acquire the sound, but you really need to know the sound to be able to use it effectively in a conversation, if that makes sense, or in improvising. So it's really complicated, and I kind of want other people's thoughts about this because it's something that I'm still thinking a lot about. And I still want to get fluent in Japanese, so that's a thing. And yeah, it kind of, I kind of just want to be able to, like, my end goal, if you want to put that, like, what is fluency in music? I'd say if you were presented with a tune, right, and you weren't told the key of the song, you weren't told the chord progression, you weren't told the melody, and you're just jamming with musicians, right, you should be able to be fluent enough that nobody could tell, right? And that's the same as like being in a foreign language. You should be able to have a perfect conversation with no accent, you know, if you want to be like perfect. Encoder overload, I don't know what that means. You know, you want to have no discernible accent. You want, you know, and this is like native level. You want to be able to not stutter all the time. You want to be able to be fluent and natural in the way that you're talking, and use all the correct words and not make too many mistakes, and really have an understanding of what's being said as well. So if you are fluent at music, you should be able to hear the chords, know their relationship to each other, really understand what's happening on a function level, and how the modulations are connected to each other and what the different chord qualities are. Understand the melody and be able to replicate it without really thinking, and being able to improvise over the changes while being aware of what you're doing on a harmonic level, like knowing, oh, I guess that's a A7 sharp 9 sound, but not really having to think about it. More like I can hear the chord change on an intuitive level. I know that sound, and I'm able to play that sound, and be able to play over that sound in a really musical way, but also being aware of what you're doing. Like, it needs both, you know, and that's something that's really, really, really difficult to get, I think. But if you look at people like Jacob Collier, who've grown up, surrounded by music, getting Cubase for his 8th birthday or whatever. I think that this is possible because we see it in people, and I think that saying that you have to be born with perfect pitch, you have to have this from childhood, is the same as saying, oh, well, you're not a Japanese native speaker, so you'll never be good at Japanese. Like, that's kind of what it sounds like to me. And I think that it's not necessarily that we can't do it, it's that the tools to get to this level don't really exist. It's not really well defined enough how it's possible to reach that. And like, that's all of my thoughts. Like, this is half an hour now of me talking about whatever I think. So if you've been bearing with me, like, thank you very much. And yeah, I'd love to hear more people's thoughts. And yes.